We're going to be looking at the book of Deuteronomy today. So if you want to turn there, looking at several different texts. And as we begin, we want to think about choices. Our lives, your life, my life, our lives have been greatly influenced by the choices we have made. And not only that, our lives are greatly influenced by the choices that other people make. A young man may choose to join the army, but it's the choices made by the nation's leaders that puts him on the front line ducking bullets. A husband may choose to commit crimes, yet his wife's choice to either reveal or hide his crimes may determine whether she goes to jail too or not. Father may move his family to the inner city, but his daughter chooses whether to study to pursue college or to stand on the street corner. A series of bad choices made by parents will have a large impact on a child's life. But the child makes choices that either puts him on a path, the same bad path as his parents, or on a totally different path. Choices, our choices and those of others, change the course of our lives. The fifth book of the Bible, Deuteronomy, is about both past bad choices made by others and the choices that the people faced at that time. The book of Deuteronomy, the name, means second law, a second giving of the law. 40 years has elapsed since the Exodus. The generation that was numbered in the first census, when they were still at Mount Sinai, about a year after the Exodus, all of those men have died because of their lack of faith in God. Their lack of faith in God led them to make choices. And so we read about them in Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus about grumbling and complaining and disobedience and lack of faith, rebellion. And so those people have died, and now as we come to the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is addressing the new generation. He looks back on the past choices that were made and the consequences of those choices. He looks forward to what the future may hold, and reflecting on the consequences and the bad choices their parents made, he makes it clear that they can make different choices. And their different choices will secure a different outcome, different consequences. And so we need to remember and understand that no matter what others have chosen, we can choose to follow God with different consequences. Doesn't mean we're free from the consequences of other people's choices, but we do have choices. We can make our choices, and those choices do matter. We make choices every day, and those choices are our choices. We have to own them. And so as we look at the book of Deuteronomy today, we're going to focus on 4 words that capture the content of the book. And these are the 4 words. Remember, relationship, responsibility, and respond. I even alliterated today. 4 R's: remember, relationship, responsibility, and respond. words that will help us make better choices. So first of all, remember. We need to remember God and the outcome of other people's choices. So this first portion of the book of Deuteronomy, if you begin and read in chapter 1, it tells us in chapter 1, verse 2, it's 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. So from where they camped out, where they received the law of God, it's 11 days' journey to the edge of the promised land, Kadesh Barnea on the south. And then it says this, and it came about in the 40th year. So they had an 11-day journey to make, and it took them, their GPS was not working so well. It was the 40th year since they had left Egypt. Verse 19 of chapter 1 and the verses that follow describe the failure of the people and describes their wandering in the wilderness. And so the people had come up to the edge of the land. We looked in Numbers and where they had come to the edge of the land and they sent in spies, and the spies came back generally with a bad report about the land, and the people whined and says, why is God going to kill us here? Why did he bring us out of Egypt? Oh, it would be better for us to, let's appoint a new leader and go back to Egypt. And despite everything that God had done for them and demonstrated to them, if you look at chapter 1, verse 32, and all of the blessings of God, all of the provisions of God, the miracles that he did, bringing them through the Red Sea, the manna that he provided for them, the deliverance from Egypt, the keeping of his promises. Verse 32 of chapter 1 says, but for all of this, they did not trust the Lord your God. They did not trust Yahweh your God. And so it was a lack of trust, a lack of faith in God that resulted in their disobedience. Look at verse 34. It says, then the Lord heard the sound of your words, and he was angry, and he took an oath, saying, not one of these men, this evil generation, shall see the good land which I swore to give your fathers, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. He shall see it, and to him and his sons I will give the land on which he has set foot, because he has followed the Lord fully. The Lord was angry with me also on your account, Moses, saying, not even shall you enter the land. Joshua, the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. Moreover, your little ones, who you said would become prey, and your sons, who this day have no knowledge of good and evil, shall enter there, and I will give it to them, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn around, set out for the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. And so they came up to the edge of the land. They refused to enter the land, and because of their unbelief, their lack of faith in God, God says, go on, you're not going in now. You're going to all wander in the wilderness until this all generation passes. And it was because of their choices that they made, because they did not believe God. They did not fear God. They did not love God. They did not trust God. Caleb, verse 36, it says, Caleb followed the Lord fully. And so out of those 603,000 men that were numbered at this point in time, of those who were numbered previously, all of them have died except for two. Joshua and Caleb. They were the spies that came back and says, we can do this. If we trust God, if we believe God, God will do this for us. He's promised it. The many died because of their unbelief and disobedience. The few, two, lived to enter the land. Moses would not enter because he chose not to honor God with his words. At the rock, he told the people, do I have to do this again? And instead of giving God, I understand Moses' frustration, and I kind of feel bad for him having faithfully served God but there was consequences. And there's consequences for our choices. And so the people, God says, I'm not going to go with you into the land. Turn around and go into the wilderness, and go, okay, we'll go. And so they got up in the morning, and it describes it here in verses 41 and to 46, that instead of accepting the consequences of their sin, the people tried to enter the land on their own. They were defeated. And now, as this next generation stands poised, about to enter the land, Moses reminds them of these things. The consequences of their parents' failure to believe and trust God. They've lived with those consequences. The people that he's speaking to now, many of them knew the slavery in Egypt, and they came out. They were less than 20 years old. So maybe there was a 19-year-old, and now he's 59 years old. He would be among the oldest of the men. And so his life consisted of youth in Egypt and his adult life wandering in the wilderness, watching that generation die. He would have been there as a number of men refused to obey God. Remember these. You have choices to make today. Remember that. Remember God and what God has done, and remember the choices that people have made, and make a different choice. They're being encouraged to make different choices, ones that are based on faith in God. Now, it's worthy of our time to consider some of the specific things that the people are told to remember in Deuteronomy. So we're just going to run through some of them. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 10. Verse 9, it says, only give heed to yourselves, keep your soul diligently, lest you forget. Okay, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, that they may teach their children. And so they're to remember God speaking to them. Not only are they to remember, but they are to propagate that. One of our responsibilities as parents is to pass on the truths of God to the next generation. And as some of you know, that's part of the reason why I wrote my most recent book, was for the sake of my own kids, that they might know some of the things that God has done, that I have experienced. Chapter 5, verse 15. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Remember what God has done. For them, they had been slaves in Egypt, and God came and he sent Moses, and by a mighty arm, wonders and signs and miracles, God brought them out. Remember, and as we think about our own lives, we sometimes forget what God has delivered us from. We sometimes forget his mercy and his grace. Chapter 7, verse 18. You shall not be afraid of them, the nations in the land. You shall not be afraid of them. You shall well remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. And as we face challenges in our lives, it's helpful for us to remember the challenges that God has already brought us through. Isn't there a verse in Amazing Grace that way? How many trials we've already been through? Help me read it here. Many dangers, toils, and snares.
I have already come.
Yeah, through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. Remember. And remembering then gives us the grace to follow. Chapter 8, verse 2, you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Remember how God has provided for you, how he led you in the wilderness. So these are the folks that came up to the edge of the land. Then they were sent back. Now that generation has died, and as we saw previously, 6 days a week for 40 years there was manna on the ground for them. It says their clothes and their shoes did not wear out. 40 years. God, it seems like a small thing, but it's a huge thing. Imagine having no shoes in the wilderness. Chapter 8, verse 18. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who is giving you power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is today. And it shall come about, if you ever forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, you shall surely perish. Remember, don't forget. Chapter 9, verse 7. Remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness from the day you left the land of Egypt until you arrived at this place. You have been rebellious against the Lord. There's things that we can learn from our own sin and our own consequences. Deuteronomy 24, verse 9 says, remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam. When she rebelled against Moses, she was made a leper. So as we look at the book of Deuteronomy, there's this emphasis on remembering. Remember God. Remember your own failures and how that turned out for you. Remember the failures of others and how it turned out for them. I sometimes said a smart person learns from his own mistakes. A wise person learns from the mistakes of others. And Moses is standing before the people. Moses himself is not going to go into the land. He says, remember, I don't get to go in because of this. All of those people died because of this. This is who God is. Remember him. Make the right choice. You have choices. The choices are yours to make. And so the remembering is to help us do what's right in the future. And sometimes we remember with remorse. As I look back over my life, there are things that I would rather not remember and I'd rather not talk about or think about. Remorse. But sometimes we remember and we have remorse and then we become sorrowful and we wallow in our sorrow. Sometimes we feel sorry for ourselves because of what's happened to us, because of other people's choices or our own choices. And that sorrow we want other people to feel sorry for us. And instead of doing what is right because of what we remember, instead of making right choices in the future, we allow our past failures to plunge us into despair and depression, and it leads us to make wrong choices. And instead, remembering we're to be motivated to make the right choices as we move forward in the future. And it's appropriate and right for our past actions to bring sorrow, but it should be sorrow unto repentance, as it says in 1 Corinthians. A sorrow that produces a change of thinking, a change of action, that we would do what is right. So the first word here in Deuteronomy is remember. The second word is relationship. Relationship. Our choices impact our relationship with God. Among the things that people are told not to forget, the things that the people are told to remember, is they're told to remember that they have a covenant relationship with God. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 23. So watch yourselves, lest you forget the covenant Yahweh your God, which he made with you, and make for yourselves graven images in the form of anything against which the Lord your God has commanded you. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. I mean, we often think of jealousy as a bad thing, and that's because it's often manifested in a bad thing. But jealousy is the desire to possess what belongs to you. Now, it can be manifested in many wrong ways, but for Israel and God, there is a picture of marriage, and Israel is God's wife. That's the picture. And that when they are unfaithful and worship idols, they are committing spiritual adultery, and God is righteously jealous. He wants them for his own because they belong to him, and it's right that they belong to him, and it's right that they're faithful to him, and so he is jealous for them. And so they're to not forget. They're not to wake up in the morning and say, oh, I don't remember, I'm married to God. In verse 31 here in this same chapter 4, the Lord your God is a compassionate God. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. God doesn't forget the relationship that he has with Israel, that he has with us. Chapter 5, verse 3. The Lord did not make this covenant with your fathers, but with us, with all of those who are alive here today. And so in a sense, in the book of Exodus, God made a covenant with the first generation that came out in Deuteronomy. He is making a covenant with this next generation, those who are here with Moses today. A covenant is an agreement. It's a contract, an understanding that governs the nature and boundaries of relationship. We're familiar with different types of covenant. Marriage is a covenant, a covenant designed by God that a man and woman make with each other for life. It's a covenant. Housing developments. I think probably of those of us here today that Eleanor and Kathy are in housing associations, and those developments have homeowner covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs, they're called, that govern the relationship between you and your neighbors. It's a covenant, and there's terms. In some ways, the United States Constitution is a covenant describing the relationship of the government and the people that they are to have. And throughout the Bible, God describes his relationship with people in terms of covenants that describe what can be expected of God and what is expected of us as people. And as with many human covenants, there's detailed outcomes for either complying with the covenant or violating the covenant. And for example, those who are in homeowners' covenants may be fined. They may even have their bank accounts garnished if they violate their homeowners' covenant. Depends on which, the association, what you've agreed to, but in some homeowners association, they can dip into your bank account if you violate the covenant. However, there's no place that allows the homeowner association to evict the homeowner. So there's, protections and otherwise. So for Israel, although God had made a covenant with the previous generation, it's necessary for each generation to reaffirm their relationship with God. And so thus the book of Deuteronomy, the second law, is affirming this covenant with the new generation. And I think we all understand that our salvation is individual. God has children, but I say he doesn't have any grandchildren. In other words, my children are not saved because of me. They have to have their own faith in God, their own relationship with God. And so here in Deuteronomy 29:1, it says, "These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he had made with them at Horeb." Horeb was a mountain, Mount Sinai. And so God made a covenant with that generation, and this is a second law. In Deuteronomy 28, it describes for the new generation of Israel the consequences of conformity to the terms of the covenant and the consequences for failure to comply. We call these, and God calls these, the blessings and the curses. And they're explicitly stated in detail. And the rest of the Old Testament unfolds for us basically how God kept his faithfulness to the terms of the covenant, and how the people living in God's land, they didn't paint their house the right color, right? They got in trouble. They had a mixed bag. Sometimes they obeyed God and they had his blessing, and sometimes they experienced the consequences. And so really what we have in the covenant in the book of Deuteronomy is this is how things are going to work. And then as you read Joshua and Judges and the Kings and the Samuels and the prophets, they're like, oh, this is what the covenant said. Oops, that's what they're doing. And oops, that's what happened to them. And it unfolds, and in that, we see that God proved always to be faithful. And sadly, the people were not. But here at this juncture, at the time of the writing of Deuteronomy, Moses is saying, okay, here's the deal. God will be your God. You will be his people. God will be like your husband. You will be like the wife. And here's the terms of the covenant. And here's the details of the prenup, if you will. This is how things are going to work. If you do this, then this is going to happen. If you do this, this is going to happen. But nowhere in that would God abandon them. There would be consequences, sometimes severe consequences, but God would always have this relationship with them. And so even when they were kicked out of the land and scattered, that was specified as this is how things are going to work. And in that, God also said, someday I will restore you. And so there's a sense in which every person who lives has a relationship with God as a creator. And in a sense, there's this relationship in terms of that relationship. But those of us who know him through Jesus, we have a covenant, a new covenant in the blood of Jesus, a relationship. And that brings us to our third word, and that's responsibilities. Responsibilities. Our responsibilities are issues of the heart, not just outward. We have a tendency to focus on the outward, but it's responsibilities of the heart. And we see this emphasized over and over and over again. You know, sometimes we get caught up in all the rules and regulations and leprosy and spots and sacrifices and all of these things. And there are lots of rules. Not as many as the IRS has, but there's lots of rules in the Old Testament. And those people count such things. They tell us that in the Old Testament law, Exodus through Deuteronomy, there are 613 commands. And 248 of those are positive commands, do this, and 365 are negative commands. Don't do that. Of those 613 commands, people count 199 in Deuteronomy. So more than its proportional share. And that's why it's called the second law. Not a new law, but a new generation receiving the same law. It's like the first wife died and now here's the new wife kind of thing. The first generation had passed away. And compliance, of course, with the laws and the covenant is important. But we should understand, as we saw in the book of Leviticus, that God knew that the people would break the law. And he says, all right, when you break the law, here, do this, do that, offer these sacrifices. We'll atone for sin. The relationship can be maintained and established. But as we carefully read the book of Deuteronomy, it reveals that God's desire for his relationship with the people went much deeper than just the outward conformity to a set of rules and regulations. We've already seen that the people wandered for 40 years and they died in the wilderness because they failed to believe God. It wasn't just their disobedience, it was their lack of faith that led to disobedience that was the problem. And there's an emphasis throughout the book of Deuteronomy on our heart. Steve read for us from Deuteronomy chapter 6. If you'd like to turn there, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, it says, "You shall love the Lord, that is Yahweh your God, with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them to your children, and you shall write them on the posts of your doors." And this idea of loving God would provide what was necessary for them to believe God and serve God and obey God. Other places, this issue of the heart. You see, our responsibilities, the obedience is an issue of the heart. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 10. This was the text that we read as we began, Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12. And now, Israel, what does God, the Lord your God, require from you but to fear, reverence the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and love him and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, to keep the Lord's commandments. Now, my translation has the word added in verse 13. It's in italics, but it's the loving of God with all our heart and soul that results in verse 13, to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I'm commanding you today. That's why in 1 Corinthians 13, there's this emphasis on love in the context of spiritual gifts. Without love, we are nothing. Without love, we're just a big sound. If we gave away everything we had, if we offered our body to be burned as a sacrifice, and we don't have love, it profits us nothing. It's the same and true in the Old Testament. See, this issue of love is not just a New Testament thing. Many people would say the Old Testament is about works and law, and the New Testament is about grace and love. And it's not true. There is law, but there is love and grace. And God hasn't changed, and the relationship that he wants to have with us hasn't changed. In Deuteronomy 13, it speaks about the danger of false prophets, and he says, the Lord will allow these false prophets to be there to test you to see if you truly love him or not. Jesus quotes, of course, from Deuteronomy 6, that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. That's what God told Israel, and that's what Jesus told his disciples at that time. And so both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant share this. Love from the heart based on faith is the essence of a right relationship with God and the greatest responsibility. The difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant is simply this, that in the New Covenant, God gives us the ability to have a heart that's right. And so this is the message. The soon-to-die Moses is giving to the people. They have behind them 40 years of wandering in the wilderness after the 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Behind them, before them, across the Jordan River is the land that God has promised them. Moses has told them, you need to remember God. You need to have your relationship with God. You need to fulfill your responsibilities to God from the heart. And so the question is, how are we going to respond? And that's our last word. We're to respond in faith. Turn over to one more text, Deuteronomy chapter 30. Moses summarizes for the people here. Verse 15. So Moses says this. He says, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity and death and adversity. In that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you will surely perish. You shall not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose. Choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants. And how do you choose life? Verse 20, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. And so there's a choice. Now, we may not have choices as great as they faced at that moment, but we have choices all the time. And of course, there is first and foremost the choice to follow Jesus, to turn from our sin and trust in Jesus for salvation. But it's not just a one-time choice. We choose. Will we follow God or will we not follow God? Will we do what God says or will we do what we want? Will we do what God says or will we do what the people around us? Joshua and Caleb are going to enter the land because they chose to do different than all the other people. We need to be like them rather than like those others. Choosing to follow Jesus literally makes a difference between life and death. And we have the daily choices. So in the words of Moses, choose life in order that you may live by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice and holding fast to him. 4 words. Remember, relationship, responsibilities, and respond. That's the book of Deuteronomy.